All right. Thank you all so much for patiently waiting. So, once upon a time, Kanya Makan and Bahut Purani Bate are cornerstones of storytelling in English, Arabic, and Hindi, three of the most common languages spoken in the UAE. To many of us, literature is an incredibly important communal archive and also a powerful invocation of our childhood memories. With that, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to our second edition of the Ras Al Khaimah Art Festival's 2025 Speaker Series. My name is Janan Farhat, and I'm a researcher, admittedly recovering bookworm, and your moderator for today's session. Our panel, titled Pages of Past Literature as a Memory Archive, takes a deep dive into the transformative power of the written word, exploring how literature shapes our identities and worldviews. Of course, for today, we have a wonderful, rich panel of speakers that I'm very honored to introduce. To our immediate right, we have Dr. Myra Garces Baksa, Associate Professor and Assistant Dean for Research and Graduate Studies with the College of Education at the UAE University. Directly to her right is Ms. Anna Seaman, an arts writer, cultural journalist, and independent curator. We also have with us Mr. Abdulaziz Mohammed Al Mulla, Library Program Coordinator at the Sharjah Art Foundation. I actually met him through the Sharjah Art Foundation's book club, would highly recommend. We also have Ms. Amal Al Sahlawi, an Emirati poet, and also Mr. Deepak Unikrishnan, an Associate Arts Professor, Literature and Creative Writing at New York University, Abu Dhabi. Welcome all. Thank you so much for coming. All right, so we're going to get right into it. Dr. Myra, I have a question for you. So, as an associate professor and the assistant dean of research at UAEU, you recently published a chapter on the reading preferences and identities of Emirati adolescents from the UAE. Can you maybe tell us a bit about why you were interested in this research and some of the key findings from your study?
So thank you for the invitation. It's really my pleasure to be here. I love
Pleasure's
Ras Al
ours.
Khaimah. I love the beach. We don't have the beach in Al Ain, so this is really a treat for me. I actually brought the book with me. So it's an edited book, edited by a very good friend of mine and also a fellow book club member. So I did have a book club in Singapore when I lived there for 11 years. So Professor Chin E. Lo was editing this book and she sent me 2 chapters to review. And when she sent me the chapters, she realized, after I gave her my review, she realized that she had no contribution coming from the Middle East. So she asked me whether I would be interested to contribute a chapter. So I immediately approached our vice dean, she's Emirati, Dr. Mona Al-Janahi, because her dissertation is actually on the multiliteracies and the reading lives of Emirati adolescents, Emirati teenagers. So while her focus in her dissertation was more on multiliteracies and fan fiction, I told her that maybe we could reframe the findings a little bit so that it could fit into the chapter. And so that's when we started working together, and she's the first author of the chapter. And among the key findings that we had is that there's a very vibrant reading culture among Emirati adolescents, although of course this is a qualitative research focusing on just a very few Emirati adolescents, but they're bilingual, so they either read in English or in Arabic. Most of them prefer reading in Arabic. And what is interesting for me as an educator is that the teenagers who read non-conventional reading materials, like for example, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, the Ruwayat al-Muntadayat, which is like the Emirati colloquial online forums, which is very similar to Wattpad, for example, or those who read Naruto or Tintin comics. They're the ones who don't necessarily self-identify as a reader, even though they read a lot. So those who read the classic literature, they identify very easily as a reader, but those who read Nabati poetry, for example, they don't immediately think of themselves as readers, which has implications for us as educators, because the reason why they think that way is because they don't feel that what they're reading are not considered legitimate reading practices, as defined by parents, as defined by educators. So the idea is for us to really expand our understanding of what being a reader means, and that we may not have to narrowly define what constitutes good literature, for example.
think it's fascinating that people don't necessarily identify themselves as readers, even though they are actually avid readers. So maybe even just trying to shift the discourse on what constitutes reading is so important because reading is um, constitutive of so many different materials, practices, and I think it also is something that just teaches young adults to be critical thinkers.
And no judgment whatsoever in terms of your choice of books. That's why the title of our chapter is From Mahmoud Darwish to Shakespeare, and Naruto to Tintin Comics.
Oh, that's incredible. Thank you so much for sharing. Um, Anna, I come to you. So, with your expertise in showcasing the visual arts in the UAE and also co-founding Moro Collective, which is an NFT curatorship, how do you think digital platforms can redefine literature as a memory archive and disseminate cultural stories?
Well, we're switching a bit from Shakespeare to NFTs. But yes, thank you for having me here. I think what came to me, what was interesting to me when you were talking just now, Myra, was, the definition of a reader obviously has to change also in today's world. We do live in a digital world. My kids are not teenagers yet, but they find they have to read when they're playing their games. There's different things that will bring them into the skill of reading, and then once that skill is learned, then of course you get the secondary layer of losing yourself in a story or a book, which is the first layer of reading, a big part of my childhood. So I am a digital art curator and art writer, and also a journalist, a writer, and a big book worm myself. So I hope that we do find different ways of redefining reading. When it comes to digital platforms, one of the things that we found when we started Moro Collective, was we need to embrace the digital age in whatever that means. In visual arts, that means something which we call NFTs. That just means blockchain verified art, which is important in the digital sphere when it comes to bringing authenticity and rarity to something which is a digital file. I think in to answer your question in terms of the memory or archiving literature, digital the digital world is moving faster than we are, and the idea of harnessing, not the idea, but the tool of harnessing, of using digital technology such as blockchain to disseminate this information is really important, and it also is democratizing access, which is vital. And coming from what we did at Morrow, we brought curation into the digital art space because we didn't believe in the same, the structure of the traditional art world, the geographical boundaries of needing to be in a specific place at a specific time to experience something, which doesn't exist in any other form for the young people of today. Like, they can play with anyone on their games in any part of the world. So we brought these ideas of fluidity of boundaries and reality versus virtual kind of into the art world, and I think that's really important in the literature as well, because if we use the digital space correctly, well, correctly is not the word I would choose actually. If we engage with the power of the digital space, we can use it as a way to democratize access, use it as an archive. We can preserve things which are so quickly flying away, and it doesn't have to be even written literature. We can redefine literature as well. So I think it's important to embrace the digital platforms.
Thank you, Anna. I think we also have this very interesting assumption about how technology is sometimes seen as a barrier also to literacy, to maybe being more, not necessarily literate, but just reading more. And I think it's because kids these days are using tech so much, and they're often on their iPads, but they're playing games or they're watching videos, but they're not always reading. And finding ways to really democratize access to literature, I think, is super important. Um, and also platforms, I think, like what is it, Kindle? It's also a really great way.
Audible as well, by the way. Like so when you define what it is to read, the brain is making pictures. When you watch a video or film or a movie, it's not making those pictures. But when you read, imagination is working. So if you can't necessarily read, listen. It's the same kind of process in the brain, and we spend a lot of time on the move in today's crazy world. So audible is also important.
And I think that's important too because we also have people who are blind and then they can't read, right? But they can listen. Or people who, I think I was actually listening to a biography on Helen Keller's life, and it was also really interesting just to learn about how much of an avid reader she was. I think she read in like 6 different languages, but she was reading in Braille, so she was feeling the words. That's also a different medium. It's a very tangible medium. But I do agree that we have, and I think we should embrace the best of what tech has to offer to help us increase and improve both young adults and also adults and children's interest in reading in general. So thank you so much for sharing. Abdulaziz, welcome. It's nice to be in the position of moderator. He's always moderating our book club sessions in the Sharjah Art Foundation, so I think it's nice for him to be one of our speakers for today. So in your experience working in cultural programming at the Sharjah Art Foundation, can you tell us maybe like what initiatives or what projects have you found to be most impactful, both bridging the past and the present through literary resources?
So the way I see it is that what I'm constantly doing, first of all, with the book club, that itself does in a way bridge the past and the present because first, we don't discriminate. We bring people from all ages and from all walks of life, and so everybody gets to share their experience from the past and the present because there are young people there who benefit from people who are of the older generation. We have participants up to like 60, 70 years old, so people participate from all walks of life and they bring in their own perspectives. But then I'm reminded by something we also did for the previous biennial, which was 2 years ago, called Stories of Our Ancestors. And we brought senior citizens from every city from the UAE. So we had these 5 sessions, 2 in Sharjah city, 1 in Kalba, 1 in Kharfakan, and 1 in Al-Hamriya. And so
No, that's Al-Khimah?
sorry?
No, that's Al-Khimah?
It's based in Sharjah, so
Okay, all right.
inshallah another time.
Next time.
But yeah, when we did this, the way we saw it was that these senior citizens are kind of like the archive of history, because a lot of them, what they brought was from their own personal experiences, and it was from people around them as well. And one of the things that somebody said from those sessions that stuck with me is that what we have is often the knowledge that we have is often not recorded, and I think it's a good way for us to start thinking of knowledge and epistemology from a perspective that is that was not brought to us by, I would say, maybe academic perspectives and kind of these formal institutions, but rather from people from who were citizens here. Even like walking around Al-Hamra, you see like in some of the houses, you see some of the houses have the recordings of people talking about the history of Al-Hamra and the history of Ras Al Khaimah. So this is something that when I did this project, it really kind of resonated with a lot of people, especially the Emiratis here.
I think we actually did a very similar initiative where we had former inhabitants of Jazeera Al-Hamra Heritage Village, which is actually the site that we're on today. And we had interviewed maybe, I think, between 5 to 10 or so former residents of this village. And keeping in mind that this village was an actual island, the sabra and fill was actually filled in with dirt. But back then, Jazir al Hamra Heritage Village was an island. Um, and we had people come, and they were actually like just recalling their experiences living here, growing up here in the 60s and the 70s, before the city, before the village was abandoned. I think it's an excellent way of also bringing people these perspectives that are not just from the ivory tower of academia, right? Where now knowledge is only valued when it's produced at a particular institutional level, and instead bringing it back to the people and valuing exactly grassroots, bottom-up initiatives. Um, so thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's beautiful, and I'd love it if you could maybe share with us the link later as well. But thank you. Aman? Actually, we have Abdulaziz and Amal, and I remember when we were putting this panel together, it was very important to us to bring together Emirati perspectives, because we are here to both represent the UAE and also to bring people from the Emirati culture to talk about their experiences. And when we, of course, I already knew Abdulaziz, but when we found Amal's profile, we thought it would be super interesting to bring a poet to the panel, because poetry is also arguably a form of literature. So, from publishing your first collection to performing globally, how would you describe your evolution as a poet? And can you maybe share any formative experiences that influenced you in your journey?
It's such an interesting topic because being a poet is being a poet. It maybe evolutes in a way that you get to share the experience more. But if you're the way you start poetry is how you see the world and how you feel about it. And I think I started journaling and writing poetry, like seriously, 12 years ago. The amazing thing came when I started actually sharing those writings with the people, and to see the interaction and to see how people think about it and how the human experience is exactly the same, whether you're from UAE or China or any part of the world. And I was privileged to recite my poems in Guadalajara and in China, Beijing, in so many places. And this realization that stunned me. We have the same feelings, we have the same ambitions, we have the same insecurities, the same fears, and I think poetry unites us in that way.
I think people usually say this about music, but we're here also to say that let's talk about how literature unites us, how poetry brings us together, because it's all in a lot of ways about human emotion, but it's also about knowledge production, knowledge creation. And I know you write predominantly, you write in Arabic, right? And I think when you talk to a lot of Arabs, scholars of Arabic, there is this fear that young people are not writing in Arabic as much anymore. And I think that applies particularly to poetry as well. But it is very important to keep the tradition alive. And yeah, there are so many beautiful poems that I remember studying in school and university as well. So thank you for contributing to that wonderful tradition. Deepak, I have a question for you. So your book Temporary People is rooted in a world that combines language, identity, and cultural memory in both Gulf and South Asian cultural narratives. So in your opinion, why is it so important to tell left behind stories and to write about the languages and experiences of people in transient spaces?
You want me to do this in 2 minutes?
No. Four. Four is
Okay,
good.
Okay. So here's the best way I can put it. So I was listening to Abdulaziz, and he mentioned senior citizens who had come in 2 years ago to speak to the audience. So in my community, so for context, I was raised in Abu Dhabi. My parents lived here for 45 plus years. I'm the third generation in my family to live in the country. But in our community, there's this sort of tacit understanding that for the most part the elders leave at some point. So access is not necessarily difficult, but you have to think about it a little bit harder. So when you phrase it as left behind stories, you also have to sort of consider what does that mean necessarily, because contextually it varies from person to person. I think at the end of the day, and sort of piggybacking on what Anna was saying, I'm going to make a generalization now. So for the most part, I think all of us take a little bit of responsibility as to the sort of stories we'd like to remember, and whose stories we'd like to remember, whether it's from our grandparents, from our friend, from a dog like the Patsaluki German Shepherd mix is right at the back. We all have our tales, but then the question is, who are you remembering for? And I think this is significant because when you're young and hopeless like I was, you don't really give due considerations to how your parents lived their lives and why they came here and what this space means to them. And English is my bridge language, so it's the only tongue I read, write, and speak in. Malayalam is what my parents speak, which I heard in the back over there. I can't read or write it, which is incredibly embarrassing in a state that sort of proclaims it as 99% literate, and then they have me. Hindi, which I also heard in the back, I can speak. I can sort of read it. Arabic I had to learn for 17 years. I can fake it for 2 minutes. But I miss hearing the language when I don't hear it. So when you have all of these languages sort of hitting your head, and Myra and even Anna had mentioned earlier, and you had said ivory tower when you sort of thought about academia, the presumption that anything written is sacred is interesting, because I come from a tradition where orality was relevant. My great-grandmother recited those stories to me. I'm also partially, I'm hard of hearing in my left ear, so I've also been paying attention to writers like Raymond Antrobus, who was born deaf with a capital D, so signage is very important to someone like him. So, and I have a tendency to go on and on, so I'm going to rein myself back and to answer the question specifically. So when this is the chaos that you're sort of encountering, when you think about languages, not necessarily literature, orality, whatever is in front of you, the visual, sign language, and languages you don't understand but you need. And maybe there's someone in the audience who recognizes a language which is a language of their grandparent, but they can't speak it. It could be Swahili, it could be Arabic, and there's a need to hear it. So what do you do with that when you have to sort of write that down? So I think fundamentally this is the intellectual answer. The basic answer is I had to leave when I was 19 years old because my visa expired. And I was studying abroad and I was homesick. And I wanted to remember my parents. So in order to remember my parents, I had to think back to tales and write them down on a piece of paper. That's how it started. And because I didn't really know anything, and I didn't think I was writing a book, I just thought I was trying to remember. So when, again, going back to Abdulaziz, and I'll end here, when you talked about senior citizens sort of recalling, and they're sort of telling you, we have knowledge, come find me. I was in that space, but I didn't recognize it as that. But because I work for a university now I have the language to sort of say it as that. But at the end of the day, like I said, I was homesick.
Thank you for being so honest. I feel like I can't top that because it's so genuinely authentic as an experience, and I think most of us can speak to that in some way. The UAE is home to so many nationalities, so many people. 90% of the country, 88 to 90% are expats, and the word expat itself, has many different connotations, sometimes negative, sometimes positive, but the UAE, in a lot of ways, has shaped who we are, all of us, including those of us who are non-Emirati. And we keep that with us, both now and in the future and wherever we go. I think writing about that in some ways is how we also share those oral stories that only we heard. And that's where I think, I wouldn't necessarily challenge what you said, but I think because the oral can only be transmitted through those who continue to transmit orally or through the written word or through technology, recording those oral stories and then disseminating them far and wide. Um, but yeah, I do think the power of the word itself, whether it's oral, whether it's written, whether it's recorded, or whether it's signed, is the most important thing. Transmission of knowledge, identity, and memory. Myra, second question. And my questions are also running away from me, so. Given your focus on education and children's literature, what role do you think children's books play in influencing early understandings of cultural memory? Maybe how can these stories influence a child's perception of history?
Um, you see, my background is not really in literature or even in languages, not even in education. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, but I am a huge book nerd. And I've always wanted to find a way to combine my passions together. And as I started teaching educators in Singapore, where my family and I lived for 11 years, teachers would often approach me and ask me, what books can I share with my students dealing with grief, for example, or there are issues of bullying, for instance, in the classroom. So that's when I started doing a lot of work with children's books and children's literature. And I would go as far as claim that children's books are the repositories of cultural memories. If you examine and analyze a children's book and look at when it was published, you will have a sense of what was important to people at that point in time. So they're like mirrors of the hopes and aspirations, of the dreams that the book authors and the illustrators and the artists have for the children of that particular generation. And if we look at it historically, at least from a very Western-centric perspective, children's books were initially written to serve as kind of like instructional texts, to socialize young people into actually frightening them into doing what they're supposed to be doing. Like, these are the correct forms of behavior, these are not the things that you should be doing. So they serve as kind of like instructional texts centuries ago. But then at the time that it was happening, fairy tales were also born. They were more subversive in nature. They were more imaginative. And I think we now live at a time when it's not so much about young children vanquishing the dragons, it's about children being the dragons themselves, or befriending the dragons even. So there are now issues of diversity and representation in picture books, for example, which is what I'm very much fascinated by. And again, that's a reflection of what is going on sociopolitically, everything that is happening in society at the time. They're mirrored in children's literature. So that's why I claim that they can serve as repositories of memories. For example, there's this one book that I absolutely love, and I would always recommend to a lot of my book club members, because I have several book clubs, not just one. I think I have 3. So it's called, it's by Catherine Rundell. She's an English author. Why You Should Read Children's Books Even Though You're So Old and Wise. So she said something, and I am just very loosely quoting here, that children's fiction helps you find things that you refine things that you did not even know you had lost. So I thought that was basically the essence, and it captures the beauty of children's literature.
That's beautiful and very, very thought-provoking. I think there are so many books that I read as a child and I loved. And then when I revisited them as an adult, I was like, oh, this is so problematic. Ooh, that is so racist. And there are a lot of books that are very timeless. There are a lot of classics that are timeless. But some of the premises, some of the assumptions in those texts are reflective of a very different time than now. And I think we underestimate how that can also influence what children aspire to be or what values they have. And I cannot help but remember reading Anne of Green Gables and wanting to be a very inquisitive, red-haired, green-eyed child, which I'm very much not. But that was a very different understanding even of girlhood, femininity. And also, I think, a bit of a controversial one at the time in Prince Edward Island in Canada. But thank you for sharing that. I think that's very, very interesting. So, Anna, as someone who's crafted cultural perspectives through your writing at the National and Habara magazine, what challenges do you see in translating intangible heritage into written narratives?
These are such big questions.
I know.
And like we are straddling, I don't know, we're going from so many different topics.
Topics.
Every time somebody talks, I feel like I have, I want to contribute or I resonate with things. But then I'm like, okay, let me talk about cultural heritage or intangible. Well, we've actually touched upon intangible heritage. Let me reframe the question, the tangibility of heritage. We talked about language and words. Deepak was really, I loved what you said about the sort of idea or the memory of hearing a language. You need to hear it, but you necessarily can't write it. Does it need to be written? What does that even mean? Like, how do we capture things in words? And you, Myra, said that I think we only have words to capture memories. I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but what I think I'm trying to say is that, like, yes, of course, we only have language. We have many multitudes of languages that are given names. We also have many other ways of communication in the verbal form, in the written form, which allows us to connect, like Emily said. Everyone has, in the end, the same human experience. The only thing we have to translate that is words. So, I mean, I'm a writer, yes, I'm a journalist, cultural journalist. I'm fascinated actually in visual arts and non-verbal form of communication, because that is the best way to get around the idea of translating and something meaning something specific. But I think what's really beautiful on this panel is that we're all working in some form or another with the written word in different languages, and it's a way of trying to reach a way to connect your soul or your mind with something that is actually universal. And that's why it's really interesting that we just had that little comment from you about the children's literature. I have 2 children and I'm re-experiencing children's literature now through their eyes, obviously reading bedtime stories. I was a big reader when I was younger, but I haven't revisited a lot of my childhood books, and it is really interesting how powerful children's literature is as an archive. I totally resonate with what you said. I think the vanquishing of the dragon versus the embracing of the dragon was something that really hit me, because my kids are always listening to this thing where they have become friends with the dragon, and from a psychological perspective, maybe that is really important to look at how we overcome challenges in our lives. So I can't actually remember what the question was, but I think I'm going towards the problems or the challenges of recording or pinning down intangible heritage. And I don't think I think it will remain a problem, and it should remain a problem, because it's not something that we can pin down. It's something that we will continue as creative souls to chase and to try to communicate and translate in our own ways, whether that's visual, oral, written, or poetic. I think poetry is one of the best forms of expressing oneself in that way, because it's like an abstract painting. It doesn't necessarily mean one thing, it means many different things. So I hope that went some way to answering the question. It wasn't just a ramble, but I'm really inspired by what everyone said.
No, I think it is very valuable, and I think this is also just a reflection on sometimes how we devalue intangible heritage, right? So orality is devalued, I think, when we compare it to the written word. And this is part of the conversation that we've been having a lot. And I hear people say this sometimes, which is, oh, the Gulf doesn't have a history. And I think we all could agree that that's a very, very dismissive, disrespectful way of talking about heritage and history in the Gulf, especially when we think of some of the historical records that we have, and how we know that, if I'm not mistaken, I think we have records saying that maybe 1200, 1400 years ago, Arabs would memorize 10,000 couplets just in one poem. And that is, in and of itself, a feat that I think most people alive today cannot do. So memory itself is something that we used to harness, and like as an Arab myself, reflecting on Arab history, that is a very important way of representing um, both Arab people's history and, of course, other cultures where orality was incredibly important. And that's one of the reasons why I thought it would be good to also reflect on the intangible. And intangible isn't just it's not just orality, it's also dance, it's also processes, um, it's also rituals, it's anything that can represent a culture or a people's history or identity. So we know that libraries are essential for community education. Abdulaziz, as the library program coordinator at the Sharjah Art Foundation, how do you use literature to engage residents with not only their local heritage, but also global conversations on collective memory and preservation?
So I think this is mainly done through the book club, where most of the it's a very diverse setting. I mean, you've been there. It's a very diverse setting, and people share from different experiences. Wherever they're from, they share what they what their experience has been and what it is for them. But I think there's another project. It was a research project that we did, which was the oral history project of certain buildings in Sharjah, in the main city of Sharjah. What we did essentially was get anybody, literally anyone who is over the age of 50 who can talk about anything that they remember about the old city of Sharjah. And um, what that brought up was how people think of how people think of you know the city of Sharjah, not just from people think it's just from a local perspective, but then you hear people talking about, oh, I remember memories with the British, I remember memories with Indians. But a lot of people think Indians just came after 1971. Yeah, and so like that's the thing. A lot of people think that, but then you have people who are saying that, who are confirming the fact that the UAE for a long time has been a place of global connection. And then one thing that one person said to me, and I'm gonna get into this territory here. We're talking about poetry. Is that he asked me, where do you work? I was like, the Sharjah Art Foundation. He was like, the first form of art in this part of the region is poetry. And exactly. Exactly. And the funny thing is, like when you talk about this, how archived history, because my grandfather used to recite certain poems continuously, and then while he's reciting them, he's talking about like big figures, like former rulers and even their family members, and how, like for example, what they used to do and what their like the poem would describe their daily routines. Yeah, exactly.
It's history.
Yeah, and so yeah, essentially like the conversation around like creating a global conversation just starts, I think, from a place where where you could ask anyone, not just like I said before, not just academics and professionals. You could literally ask anyone and find out something happened a long time ago or even recently that we might not even know of.
Can I ask what was the outcome of the project? Any interesting findings you'd like to share?
Well, it was an internal project essentially because we were trying to kind of canonize the history of the buildings, because when we take a lot of the buildings, we're not going to say that we're not going to say what the history of that building was without actually knowing. Because so a lot of the heritage buildings that we have are still unnamed because people don't know whose house it was. Everyone gives us a different answer, and so we still have some unnamed houses, and some of them we've kind of like created some, I think, more of a alternative history, I would say.
Funny enough, actually, a lot of the houses in this village are also registered in the names of people in Ras Al Khaimah. Like the municipality has a record of who owns what houses in this village, which has actually 550 buildings. FYI, historical fact for you all. I am particularly passionate about Jazira al Hamra Heritage Village. I did some research on it as well, which is out now, published in January 2025. Some shameless self promotion here. It's always nice to get a paper out. But thank you so much, Abdulaziz, for sharing that. And I think buildings do have some of the most interesting stories, and they tell stories about the people who lived there, but also the environment itself. Like, what are the building materials that were used, and where did people source them? Who made them? And what state they're in now will also tell you about that process through, yeah, I think they call it historical HBR or something, historical documentation records. You have to ask an archaeologist maybe. But yeah, thank you so much. So Emin, I have my second question for you. So you've participated in several prestigious literary events, sharing your work across global platforms. Is there maybe a specific poem or recitation from your portfolio that you feel embodies the power of literature to bridge personal experiences with wider cultural narratives?
I have several poems that come to mind. Most of my work, people who have read my work, they know that it's very personal, but it's also universal. It is something that would touch people from different paths of life, from different backgrounds, different ages, and I think this is what makes it special, because you could relate to such poems whether you bake a cookie in your kitchen or like run a big company. It's basically a human experience. I would like to read a piece I wrote. I actually recited this,
Please.
and if it's okay, I would read it in both language.
Yeah, please,
Yes.
please. That would be great.
I'll start with Arabic, and then I'll go to English. حلمت أنني أنحدر من سفح أخضر، كنت أنهمر بصيغة سائلة، وأجرف أتباعي من الحجارة والأسماك والأغصان المتكسرة، وزنبق أبيض وبط كأنه الصباح، وأسألهم إلى أين نذهب، فتومئ الأشجار إلي كي أمضي، هرعت كجيش شجاع مأخوذا بهتاف أتباعي، أضيق وأتسع، أغير شكل الجبل دون رغبة ملحة في ذلك، أنقذ صبيا من الغرق، أسمح بالصيد للجائعين، تغسل سيدة على خاصرتي ثياب التعب، وتصهل الخيول في أذني بقصص المغيب، كنت أمتد مثل الكون، تنقل الطيور أخباري إلى الغد لتستعد القرى بالغناء، كنت أحمل بقايا الأمس وأغسلها لتذهب طاهرة من العرق، كنت آخذ كل شيء إلى حتفه كنهر لا يمل من الجريان. I dreamt I was gliding down a green valley, streaming with unyielding liquidity, sweeping away my subsidiaries, the stones, the fish, the broken bows, the white lilies, and ducks as white as daybreak. Before asking the question, where do we go? The trees nodded, I should flow. And so I rushed like a gallant army, thrilled by my followers' chants. I tapered, I swelled, I reshaped the hill without intent. I saved the boy from drowning and let the hungry cast their nets in my waters. A woman washed off her burdens of my brimming banks. Horses whispered their stories of my eventide. I spread out as wide as the universe. Birds bore my tidings to the day after. So villages would draft ahead their songs. I carried yesterday's trouble along till cleansed of wakeful toil. I bore all to their destinies, like a river that never tires of flowing.
That was absolutely beautiful. Do you mind if I ask if you translated the Arabic into English, or if you had someone translate it for you?
No, someone actually translated for me.
Can I ask you, because I know translation can be such a political act, what was that process like for you? Did you feel like the English captured the meaning of the Arabic?
I have an interesting theory about translation because um, everyone knows if you have a special language like Arabic or Indian or some languages are really rooted in the culture, and some languages are like English, very universal. Everybody speaks them. They can carry a lot of weight. What I think some poems are translatable and some aren't. If you ask me in Arabic, for example, if you translate something to Al-Mutanabbi, nobody would get the meaning. Nobody would get the context around it, so they can actually feel it and appreciate it. For example, if you translate something to Mahmoud Darwish, it would be very easy to understand in every language. So this poem in particular is one of the things that I thought, okay, this is something that we can share. And we had a long conversation about it with the translator. Her name is Selma Harland. She lives in UK. And we talked about the metaphor behind it as well. And this is why when I recite both, and people who speak both languages, they would actually relate and feel the relevancy in both.
Thank you. It's very beautiful. I think the English is very potent. The Arabic original is also very emotional, right? And absolutely beautiful. I don't think I can add too much in terms of analysis. But yeah, that was incredible. Actually, in our last panel, we had musicians as speakers, and at the very end, a few of them sang, and we realized if we had had them sing at the beginning, we could have had more people join. So we should have maybe started with a poetry recitation. Lesson learned for next
We
time.
can sing, by the way. We can all sing.
Thank you. All right, Deepak, your teaching experience at NYOW spans creative writing and, of course, interdisciplinary studies. How do you incorporate the themes of memory and identity into your courses? And in what ways do your students engage with these concepts in their own work?
So I'm an accidental academic. I didn't major in literature. I teach it. I didn't major in most of the things I teach. So what I'll say is I come from a generation, every time anyone opens a sentence with I come from a generation, it means they're not young anymore. So I come from a generation where communities only told their own stories. So I come from a Malayali family, so we recited the stories of the Malayalis. We weren't really interested in anyone else. We pretend we are, but we really weren't. So there's a public-facing personality and there's an inward-facing personality. Infuse that with arrogance, and what you get is you feel you are special, other people aren't. That is sort of changing, and because I try to teach, if I say I teach, I'm lying, I try to teach, I sort of notice that my students want to talk with each other and across communities, and this is very important to them. And you sort of wonder about what that means, not necessarily for someone who's only 17 or 20, but also for someone who's 45, 75, or if they get that far, 85. So a very specific example of this is me citing, say, Faral Qasemi's work, the visual artist, and at the same time bringing in Abdurrahman Munif, because I want to sort of make a point. I don't read him in Arabic, I read him in English. and at the same time bring in someone like Benjamin who writes in Malayalam, translate it into English, and sort of said they all come from here. And you said earlier, around 15 minutes ago, there's this presumption that nothing existed here, which is kind of funny. And you sort of wonder about where that comes from. And there's also this mythology behind fakeness that is easy to sort of label on the Gulf, especially in a country like this. And again, you sort of wonder, where does that come from? So to answer your question, say that again?
Orientalism.
Yeah, of course, but it also comes. I think sometimes Orientalism is useful to sort of look at the West, but I'm also looking at the East, like members of my own family who presume little was here, but they don't necessarily know that folks on the subcontinent showed up way back. And you sort of have to, flag that and say, hold up a second, where is this coming from? So I'm going to share with you an example I use in class, because I thought about this for a while. I used to teach a class called Street Food. I don't do that anymore. Because food is in now, everyone's doing it, so I stopped teaching it. And the hardest assignment that I've given my students, at least what they've shared with me, is the following. So I tell them, and I teach for an American institution, it's called NYU Abu Dhabi, but it's as Americana as it gets. Students come from everywhere. We sort of celebrate the fact that we have 100 and something nationalities, they speak multiple languages. So here's the assignment. You need to go to the dining hall, you need to order rice and curry. You need to sit down, and you have to do this during peak period. Yeah?
You'll make us all crave curry now.
Yeah, but here's the rest of the assignment. And I want you to eat your meal with your fingers. And I want you to end your meal by just doing. That's it. That's all you have to do, and you can't do this in a group, so it doesn't look like it's a cult. You have to go on your own to the dining hall at 1 in the afternoon, order this, sit down, eat your meal. Half of the students couldn't complete the assignment. And half of my students are from communities where when you eat at your home, you eat with your fingers. You're eating things that are very familiar, but they refuse to do it. So you sort of want, and the why is relevant, because you sort of ask them why. I said, well, everyone's looking at me. But then you sort of break it down, right? So now this is the intellectual in me. There are forks and spoons and trays and plates, and everyone needs to be on their best behavior. And then you think about what happens when food is an intimate activity, where you sit down, and we used to sit on the floor in my home, like it's the OG of eating. And you sit down, use your fingers, you eat, it's things all over your face, you don't give a damn, and you chat. They found it very difficult to do, and you can sort of extend this to corporate meetings. So this is an assignment for anyone who wants to do this. If you have a corporate meeting, especially with strangers, order rice and curry, sit down, have utensils, but eat with your fingers. Few people do that. And you sort of wonder as to, and this is a read of what is going on and what you're asked to perform. But at the same time, it hits multiple registers. It hits the register of what you're expected to do, what you're presumed to be, what is flavor, what is comfort. But I don't break it down like that. I just say, okay, so try again. So I guess what I'm saying is sometimes, and this is an assignment, I didn't expect to do this, but I just wondered what it was like to just sit down and have a meal and not give a damn that you're having a meal. And I think and because you asked why my students, they feel they have to be the best at everything, but they also feel they have to conform. And when you sort of conform, you sort of recognize that there are certain things you give up. And now I'll sort of circle it back with a sentence and I'll end, I promise. I'm a teacher, which is why we love the sound of our own voice. Basically, what happens is, and I need to preface this. So I wasn't saying earlier that orality is being undermined, but I do wonder, what does it mean when you write a text that came from orality and if no one reads it? How does it die? How does it live? And this is sort of connected to the assignment itself. Like food is, it's an inheritance. You inherit the flavors of your elders and you take it with you, because I firmly believe the body is an archive. I'm not the first person who said this. So when that's the case, when you have an assignment like this, you hope to God that they sort of recognize where they are at this point in their lives and what they're doing. And then you cross your fingers and hope that they revisit this moment. So that's what I'll say. The curry is good on campus sometimes.
And when they had this experience, did you ask them to write about it or talk about it?
No, because you know, I hated school, which is the other irony that I teach for a living, because you're always told what to do. And then I had a student sort of take me aside and say, I felt so much shame, but I don't want to share it publicly. So it's an option because you're asking them to confess. So then the question is how do you confess? So yes and no. I give them the option to write about it, and then my students started to cheat because someone would say, because you also have students who've never eaten with their fingers before, so they're using one finger to pick up rice, and you sort of go, how does that even work? So they had 2 or 3 students who'd be the ringleaders. They'd go to the dining hall as a collective, and eventually it became known as Deepak's assignment, only he'll give something like crazy. But it was also about partnership. As students, I think it's important to know how to break the rules. This is being recorded right now. Okay. I think it is important to learn how to break the rules because your teachers presume they know what's best for you, and your teachers can also be wrong. So in my head, I wanted them to learn something by trying this out, but I failed to recognize that not everyone learns the same way. They need help or assistance, and sometimes they just don't want to do what you want to tell them to do, and that's okay. I did have one write-up that was phenomenal. The student ended up being a writer, not because of this assignment. I had nothing to do with it, but that's also lovely when that happens.
I think just a really good way of challenging students to experience something in 101 different ways. As you said, it touches upon pretty much everything, their heritage, I think their own understandings of what sometimes it means to be civilized, right? And I think, unfortunately, the word civilized comes up way too much when it comes to food and when it comes to what a culture eats. And I think we also know that food has history, and what people eat historically depends on where they are. And I know that I think in East Asia, maybe in South Korea, eating chicken feet is something that can be looked down upon. But it was, if I'm not mistaken, historically, like poorer people would eat, but quote unquote less desirable body parts of certain animals, and then that becomes something that is shameful, right? So I think that's actually a very, very great exercise that you made, that you asked the students to do, and also just leaving it up to them to share, because it is a very vulnerable thing, to put yourself out there as a student. And
I mean, can I quickly say you've put in 4 sentences more succinctly than I could in the past 10 minutes when I was trying to figure this out. But that's exactly right. That's exactly what it is.
yeah, because it just boils down to how civilized are you? Do you eat with your hands? Do you eat with a knife, spoon, and fork? Or do you eat with chopsticks? And I think now it's more acceptable to eat with chopsticks, because you can also be more cultured. Oh, you're an Arab eating with chopsticks? Oh, you're a man or woman of the world. And I'm still trying to learn how to use the chopsticks, and I tell my friends, I'm like, hey, I didn't grow up eating East Asian food. This is challenging for me. But then I have friends who grew up in like Chinatown in California, and they're like, yeah, it's all good. I grew up eating Korean food. I'm like, okay, cool, good for you, but that's great. But then also food becomes sometimes a measure of your worldliness, and how civilized are you? Do you eat with your hands or not? Do you look down on certain foods or not? Are you open to experiencing people's cultures through their experience? So, thank you. We've kind of come to the end of the session, and I know we're a little bit past the hour that we started at, but I thought if maybe anyone wants to share from our lovely panel or from the audience, does anyone want to share an example of a piece of literature that has maybe helped you understand a different culture or a perspective, if there's anything?
Okay, it's me again. Raymond Antrobus wrote a book of poetry, since we've been talking about poetics. called The Perseverance. And it's basically a book about anyone who couldn't hear but who needed to figure language out. It's astonishing. It's just astonishing.
Thank you. I need to take note of that. I mean, when you ask that question, there's literally so many things going through my head because almost every book I read is about a kind of culture that I haven't experienced or a place. I'm in a book club too, and we actually this month are reading books translated from other languages. I think it's always really important. So I feel like frozen. I can't think of one book. I definitely need to write that down, but it's just comes back to what we've been speaking about at the beginning, this idea of archiving. Almost every perspective is a valid one. You know, the skill of writing is another conversation, but learning through writers, through artists, through poets, through song about other people's cultures or specific stories. At the end of the day, it's stories. That's why children's stories maybe are the repositories of culture, because it's stories. It's about finding a way to connect, and when you can have that narrative. I've just thought of a book. I first read The Kite Runner when I was on a bus in Bristol, and I was crying. Like, and I love books, but I don't often cry in public. Maybe this comes back to the eating in public conversation. But I remember sitting on the top of the bus reading this book, The Kite Runner, which is about children in Afghanistan who run around on rooftops and I was probably young. I can't remember. I was in my 20s, and I was just like, wow. That's a book that came to me. So there we go.
If I were to add mine, it would be Sean Tan's The Arrival. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Sean Tan, but he's like one of the biggest author-illustrators in Australia. He won the Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award, which is like the Nobel Prize for children's literature. And I believe that he created the book The Arrival for something like 10 years. It's absolutely wordless. There are no words in that book, all images. But they speak about displacement and dispossession in a very surreal manner, and about the migratory nature of humans as well. And I think it's rooted in the fact that his father is originally from Penang, Malaysia. His mother, I believe, is Irish, Australian. So he is interracial, he's biracial. And that sense of being in a different country, a country very different from your country of birth, and that sense of not belonging and being able to reflect that in such beautiful imagery that is evocative of so many emotions. That's what The Arrival captures. And we're so happy that we were able to actually interview him for a month-long reading festival that we have organized with the College of Education at UAE University. This was 2 years ago. He was not able to physically come, but he joined us online. We had the entire thing at the Mohammed bin Rashid Library in Dubai. We had children come as well. He's not just a brilliant person, he's also a wonderful human being. He sent a free copy of his animated film, The Lost Thing, which is also a beautiful, beautiful book that he has written and illustrated himself, and which he has turned into an animated film that won the Oscars. So it's like a 15-minute animated film that he just sent for free. So we have that film viewing at the Mohammed bin Rashid Library in Dubai with so many young children in attendance, our undergraduate students, our PhD students as well. And they had the privilege of asking him questions afterwards. It was all online, but it was just a beautiful experience.
I think I want to add, since we're making confessions here, one of the novels that really stunned me was 1984 actually, and actually two work of art. One of them is 1984, which is like you all know the story, know the idea and the context behind it, and it stuns me that it's so relevant now in so many ways. This is one. The other one is a poem by an Egyptian writer. His name is Ahmed Abdel Mu'ti Hijazi. He wrote the poem in 1957. I read it a few years back, and the poem is a love poem. When I read it, I was amazed how something a guy wrote in the 50s can be so relevant now, and I can feel every word. I can actually measure love by it in the modern life we're living now. The same thing goes to 1984, which shows how powerful imagination is and how powerful the written word is as well.
If I may add, I would also. So for me, I think the most like the author that really kind of like strikes me always like every single one of her books just captures me, and I start reading them as soon as they come out. Is Elif Shafak. Yeah, so her books, like every one of her books is amazing, but then as you get into it, you kind of learn. Like the last one that came out there, Rivers in the Sky, it talks about like the displacement of the Yazidis and taking of their land, and also talks about like resource extraction. As we think of resource extraction as oil, but then she talks about water from that perspective as well. And then other books like Three Daughters of Eve and so on, Honor. Those are all like great books. Like I think Elif Shafaq is like really captures beautiful stories and beautiful, important topics that we should talk about in our daily lives.
I think she translates her own work as well, which is really,
She's amazing.
really difficult and amazing. I'm a big fan of her as well.
Thank you all. I feel compelled to share my own. I was earlier thinking of Khalid Hosseini because I think I read A Thousand Splendid Suns in the corner of my 9th grade classroom, and I was like, I need to finish this book before the next class. I remember that book. I remember reading a lot of books by African Americans and also books on African American literature when I was around 12 or 13. And the autobiography of Malcolm X, but also some other books that are maybe controversial now. Uncle Tom's Cabin, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry by Mildred Taylor. A lot of these books helped me think differently even about American literature because I know there's a lot of different perspectives out there also on like, what it means to be American, but also just looking at it from a historical perspective and getting insight into like the experiences of former slaves as well as their descendants. And I think perhaps a book that helped me understand Middle Eastern culture better. Maybe culture is not the right word, but also just history is Desiring Arabs by Joseph Massad. And that book rocked my world. I think if I could name a book that changed my outlook on life, it would be that book. And it just kind of revolutionizes how we understand gender and sexuality and identity, looking at the Middle East and Arabs in particular, and also just changing what we know or what we think is the truth or not. But yeah, that would be my additional contributions. And we're definitely quite a bit beyond schedule, but this panel has been so much fun for me personally. And I just want to take a moment to thank you all so much for being so candid, for being so giving even in your responses, and for sharing everything that you have. Can we maybe have a round of applause, please, for our speakers? And yeah, thank you so much also to our audience for being very attentive. And I think our speakers may be here for a little while longer, so if you want to quickly chat with them, please feel free to do so. But yeah, I hope that you all are enjoying this very nice day. Actually, the weather's been improving a little bit, I think, now. There's a bit of a draft. It was a little humid earlier. But again, thank you all so much for coming and for listening.